great verse of the Qur'an, right? Surah Al-Ankabut, the chapter of the spider, it is called, number 29, and the second verse of that chapter. Do people think they will say, I'm a believer, and that they will be left to themselves as they are without being tested? No way. And the verse afterwards, God actually says, وَلَقَدْ فَتَنَّ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ فَلَيَعْلَمَنَّ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ صَدَقُوا وَلَيَعْلَمَنَّ الْكَاذِبِينَ. Verily we will test them, meaning these people who say we have believed. Verily we will test them like we tested those before them, to sift out and determine who are the truthful and who are the liars, to this claim of we have believed. Meaning what? That it is at the very essence of living and being alive, in this case as a Muslim, if you proclaim I'm a believer, that you will be tested. And that is the Islamic perspective towards life as a test. So that's the second foundation. First foundation is life is temporary, right? The meaning of this life is that life is temporary. Second is that life is a test, and you are going to be tested. If you are a believer, and you will be tested in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not now, maybe things are really cruisy, but at some point you'll be tested.
Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to another episode of Boys in the Cave. My name is Tanzim and I'm joined by my co-host Josh, and alhamdulillah we're joined by someone very special today. This is going to be a pretty emotional episode, I reckon. But because this brother here with us today, he just did a talk at University of New South Wales titled, what was it titled again, Josh? If God is all merciful, why is there suffering? So I think he's in the zone now, about more discussion. But essentially, who we have today, we have Farazz Nomani, and he's a public speaker, activist, and student of Islamic knowledge, a graduate of economics and law. Farazz also studies the Islamic sciences with specific interests in the Qur'an, having memorized it and its sciences, theology, law, and Arabic. He speaks on a range of issues connected to Islam and regularly participates in discourses and debates with atheists, theists, and academic voices. He has debated at the national level and has a keen interest in polemics and epistemology. And on top of that, Josh and Farazz are probably close. They go way back. And even with Farazz, even though I'm not probably as close as Josh is with Farazz, I've known him for quite some time actually in the community. So, assalamu alaikum Farazz, and welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you very much for having me, brothers. It's a pleasure to be here.
It was a long overdue podcast. We've been a busy man. Yeah, and so alhamdulillah, we're glad you've had the opportunity to come on. And
the thing is, Farazz has been such an integral part of the MSA uni scene for such a long time, and he's sort of taken some time off that. So to see him again after so long, it brings back so many memories of 2013, 2014 times. You weren't there. You were still in high school.
I was still in high school.
You were still in high school.
And
very flattering words there, brothers, but jazakumullah khairan, whatever Allah has allowed us to have a small contribution, and it's been an interesting ride, that's for sure.
Because I think I actually mentioned this like every podcast episode. We have most of our viewers are from America, and so that's why we actually with the podcast we started it out, because the Sydney scene is very unique, but there's some big namers in the community, and I feel like because of how all the Islamic kind of media is from America, you think like all the online figures are only in America, you get me? And all the big kind of community leaders are all in America, but it's not the case. So it's about everyone kind of honing in their own community. So that's why someone like yourself has been pretty prominent in the community. I actually gave you a shout out in the Yasser Morsi episode.
Oh, wow.
Did you hear that one?
Did you hear that one?
I didn't. I listened to most of it. I remember listening to it on my phone. I think I got to about the 40-minute mark, so maybe I didn't. If it was at the end, then I wouldn't.
Okay, no, it was like literally at the beginning.
Okay, cool. Then in that case, yes.
Because I personally knew you pretty well through Samarkand pages and all that.
You actually started at that point. No, I didn't start it actually. I didn't start Samarkand. I came to power through a bloodless coup that took place.
You were one of the admins at one point. I do remember.
I still am. But look, anyway, long story. But it was all good fun. But some brothers had started it off, and they got busy, and so they handed it off to some other brothers.
I think it's sort of run dry in the past few years because there used to be some really intense Facebook discussions once upon a time, just regarding politics and different things. Yes. How the scene in Sydney has been evolving.
Yes,
it was like you ripping into it, and then Yasir ripping into it, and other brothers are like, that's my memories of you initially. I'm like, oh man, this guy a bit fiery, but
bro, I wouldn't call myself fiery, but maybe at moments. But I've become a little bit placid, if anything. So, but anyways, yeah.
I think it's great because it sort of represented like a political coming of age for like the youth of Sydney sort of thing. Because Faraz provided for us that sort of more hardline, not hardline per se, but more conscious political angle of how we should view the religion and politics, and not be I'm looking for a less intense word than sellout. That's what I have.
Not be beholden to the conventional mainstream.
To the white gaze, you could say in a certain lens. Yeah. But yeah, because as you were saying about our viewers in America, like the situation we have in Sydney with regards to how we interact with Western society is so different. As in, you could attest to that, Faraz, about how like we don't have the same discussions in them as them. For example, they're really, say, the more conservative ones they're really against the idea of liberals and like I don't know what do you call it, certain ideologies overtaking their campuses. Whereas for us, it's really a different sort of discussion altogether. Could you touch a little bit on that, like what you've seen? With
look, it's a very, very interesting point. The American community is like a beast in itself, right? And what we've got here is so different on so many levels. Like I think, I don't know if they're ahead of us. I don't know if we'll see a similar time. But this divide between, sort of so-called conservative Muslims and Muslims who have perhaps, I don't know, for want of a better word, looked to other political sort of ways of thinking in their language, in their political resistance to the mainstream, and especially now in the Trump era to, the sort of alt-right and so forth. That divide that I see is so polarizing over there. It's so strong. It's so vicious.
Seems like a clash of civilizations, like the outright and then the left-leaning, I guess, the liberals they call it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then within the Muslim community, you've got like this, conservative almost reaction to the sort of more liberal-leaning Muslims, and it's like, and you see it in the likes of some of the brothers that you've had on the podcast in the past. They're very vehement on that and very, very strong in their language. So, I mean, I actually don't think we've got too much of that here at the moment. There's no prominent speaker, at least that I know in the Muslim community, that has gone out that hard against Muslims who may borrow a little bit from, those sorts of political leanings. We've had our discussions and challenges. There's no doubt about that. But I just don't see that sort of polarization just yet. Anyway,
I think there's a lack of relatability as well, because we don't have that same framework of viewing the world as like the Democratic Party or the Republican, like always at each other.
Yeah.
We're more like, I think the Sydney community in general is much more on the conservative side, as in we understand the deen better. We understand that it's just, you can't have women.
We're all in the similar same wavelength.
Yes.
You can't have women leading prayer, as in not that we're like it's just that America, they view it as like a possibility, whereas we're more like we have that traditional sense of
like, I'll give you an example.
Things can't be like that. Yeah.
Even recently, very recently, there was a post. I don't know if you've seen it, Faraz. It was, Muslim girl. I think there's a Instagram. She's really big, and she has her own like brand called Muslim Girl, and she's meant to be kind of, not obviously overly religious, but somewhat has the deen and, trying to benefit the community. But now what we've seen, and she's out from, I think, America or UK, what she's done now is recently she put like a post up for scholarships, and there was one scholarship for Muslim gays. So for Muslim, like homosexuals. Right. And then she's like, if you're a Muslim out there and you feel like homosexual, there's like a scholarship on offer. Right. And it's crazy. Like, I saw the post, I'm like, well, this is like you're championing kind of homosexuality now.
It's one of those popular, like, liberal sort of magazines that are really sort of in vogue and like Muslim as a new identity in America.
And we don't experience any of that. I've never seen it in the Sydney community. Have you seen it? Like,
look, it exists, not in Sydney, maybe in other parts of Australia. I think Melbourne perhaps a bit more. There's that so-called gay imam. I think Brother Noor, his name is. And I think it probably will become a bit more open in the future as well. But it's just interesting in the sense that in America, it really, really is a lot more open. And definitely the community, when it comes to this sort of, and I hate to use it, but this sort of liberal, conservative sort of demarcation, there are a lot more voices in the American Muslim community that seem to emerge from that sort of left-wing positionality, right? Whether it's on issues such as progressive values, social justice, LGBT issues, racism, feminism, whatever. It just something is going on there that has led to that. And I think probably what it is Muslims have been there for a lot longer. right? Muslims have been in America for a lot longer, and they have been sort of subject to the backlash from right-wing America for a lot longer. And obviously since September 11 and George Bush and all that he did. And so Muslims, in trying to find a voice to resist, find that voice from a left-wing vantage point. But because there's so much other ideological baggage that comes with that runs counter to many of the normative positions of our deen, you end up having these sorts of things, right? And I think that's basically what's going on. So I don't know if that's hit the nail on the head, but I think that is perhaps a little bit of what's happened there.
Yeah, just to track us back a little bit, we wanted to discuss your involvement in the MSA scene. Because just here at UNSW, which is me and Tanzim campus, you were sort of part of the foundation of how the MSA came into being. Part of its synthesis, how like we sort of found a home, like all the domestic Muslim students, because there was some problem with other bodies on campus and we couldn't have our own events. And so you were sort of one of the first brothers. Like, we wanted to ask you, so where has the MSA, like how has the MSA sort of developed over these years that you sort of finished uni, now you're working for the past few years, as in, has it been going in a better direction? Because things used to be really sort of packed out and really like, there used to be a lot of commotion on campus, everyone was excited. I think it's died down a bit, like in the past few years, in Sydney anyway.
I think it's an interesting question. I think what's happened is there's a lot more MSA activity happening just generally, like from other MSAs as well. But even there, to be honest, there's ups and downs. So I'm not sure if that would be accurate. I think there's a element of novelty that is there when things are new and when they happen for the first time.
Yep.
And when they become part of the furniture or they become sort of usual, I think that always has a bit of a sort of like, oh, well, there we go again. It's happening again, that sort of thing. So the MSA on this particular campus, and for your listeners, it's a very interesting history, controversial history of multiple bodies existing on the same campus. Obviously, we won't go into the details of that.
Can
but
I sum it up?
Sure.
Faraz rebelled against the caliph on campus.
That's an interesting way to put it. But, you know, like it happened and, you know, we did what we needed to do to give domestic Muslim students a voice and some autonomy in being able to decide the direction of activism that you know, local Muslim students were going to have. And the first few years were fantastic, as Josh mentioned, lots of big events and so forth. But I think things are still pretty good, to be honest. I think, you know, there's with the MSA scene, with the youth dawah scene generally, there's always ups and downs. It depends on the people involved. It depends on their enthusiasm. It depends on volunteers. I think now seems to be a decent time. There's been some interesting events in the last little while. And that's just the way that MSA politics and MSA activism is, to be honest. There's always ups and downs. There's never going to be this like upward trajectory. And that's one thing I've come to appreciate about not just the MSA scene, the community generally. There's ups and downs in activities. There's times where there's really robust activity. There's times where you're just wondering what's going on. Everyone's quiet. So that's just, it's like much like personal life, where people go through ups and downs. I think the community is a little bit like that when it comes to activism.
Yeah, I think I sort of realize now in my later years of university that the MSA is sort of more like a brief stint of like energy you have and appeal to this zeal, to learn a lot more about the religion and contribute and be active. And for me, that sort of faded away because I've just been doing it for 3-4 years. And it's sort of like a great opportunity you have, but it's not something lasting. So we wanted to sort of, from that sort of segue into how we should conduct our youth activism in general in the community. Sort of like, would you say that MSA is sort of the best outlet for like a young Muslim to channel their...
I think it's a really good outlet. And there's a lot of criticisms that are made of university students and of MSAs and all that sort of stuff. Some of them are very valid. For instance, you know, it's a bit of a cocoon. It can be a little bit insulated. It's a little bit divorced. It's a bit privileged, of course. University students are usually middle class, upper middle class type people who've done reasonably well in high school to get there. So it's definitely not the whole community. But the reality is that it does. It is probably a breeding ground for future leaders of the community, right? Muslims who will go on to, you know, be influential in the community by leading community organizations, that will be involved in activism, that will be prominent spokespeople, that will be in the media eye, that will therefore become faces of Muslim Australia, as it were. So for that reason, it's a really, really important breeding ground and provides a great opportunity for those who are keen to learn the dynamics of the community to spend some time doing so, because the MSA scene is a microcosm of the community. You'll have Salafis, Sufis, you know, Tahriris, Ikhwanis. Everyone is in the mix. Everyone is jostling sort of for influence over the MSA, and that's natural, right? That's completely fine in my view. There's no problem with that. And you know, in that negotiation between different sort of worldviews, as it were, it becomes an interesting melting pot. So I think it's a great place to just come to terms with the fact that there are great differences in the ummah. There's some things that we all unite on, of course, but then there's also differences in how you learn to live life, cooperate towards good, while working with people that you don't necessarily see eye to eye on with everything. And to be honest, that is, if you can summarize life in one word, that's life, right? And so to be thrown into that sort of environment and be forced to deal with different people, but still on a, on a sort of united path, I think that's what the MSA scene is really good for, and equipping people with the tools to be able to do that.
You mentioned that, there's only a select few, like, let's just hone in on University of New South Wales. You need like a good ATAR to get into a degree here. And then, as you mentioned, it becomes kind of the place where future leaders are born. So within this select few of Muslims that actually do get here, we are in a community of Muslims that are talking about specific issues only amongst themselves. So do you feel like sometimes when we organize events or talk about certain issues within that small group, we're not actually dealing with the whole community at large, that we're in our own bubble sometimes?
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. That's a given. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, right? There may be issues which are pertinent to that small audience, but which are very, very relevant at that point in time to that small audience. Like, you can never deal with the issues of the whole world, right? It's impossible to expect people in a certain context to be able to constantly look outside that context and address all the needs of the community beyond that little bubble that they're in. That's natural, right? Constraints of time, constraints of resources, constraints of knowledge, constraints of maturity even, right? So it's hard to expect university youth to provide the answers and hold the events and everything that's needed as the be-all and end-all for the community's entire problems. I mean, there's drug problems, there's domestic violence, there's sex before marriage, there's, people's sexuality, and there's so many issues, right? There's so many issues. There's poverty. There's all these issues. You can't expect a university audience to do that, a university crowd to do that. But if they try, and if they're cognizant of these issues, and they start doing something to address them in whatever capacity they can, that is only a good thing. That is only a good thing. And I've noticed a little trend in the last little while that MSAs seem to be doing that more. They seem to be getting more real. And what that shows to me is a greater bridge between the MSAs and the community, a greater willingness to recognize the community's problems. And I think that can only be a very, very good thing.
So Faraz, just on that point, just to go back to a point you mentioned about the MSA.
Yep.
You were talking about lack of maturity in a certain sense. And I just want to expand on that because I've had my own sort of realizations after being in the uni for so long. And I think there's a bit to be expanded on the criticisms. For example, like, I'll just give a brief example about myself.
Sure.
Like, I didn't properly learn how to talk to girls until about like third, fourth way into uni. And that was because I started working and I had a female boss. So I was forced to be put in that environment where I'm like, okay, she's a human being. To put it like that. Yeah. And you have to interact with her in like a professional way.
Yep.
You get what I mean?
Yeah.
Because the MSA gives you sort of weird or warped expectations of what gender interactions are. Because even people in the MSA, they have no fixed idea. They just say, oh, lower your gaze or don't talk. And different brothers say different things, and they think they're being traditional and they're being all upright and stuff. But it really just hinders your sort of development in a sense. Because like we're in a society which is Western, and in your workplace you have to learn to deal with these things at a certain point. And also sort of like I had the feeling that it's sort of the MSA can fester you in a certain sort of way. Like you get stuck in a certain circle of people just talking about the same things. And a lot of it can be esoteric. Like they're talking about like fiqh all the time. Like it's great, you improve your knowledge, but in a certain sense, you become mired down in a certain way of thinking, which even Islamically, I think didn't help me in a lot of ways. I was just like, I had to sort of get out of that environment to put Islam in perspective. Well, so many other things deserve my time, like my family, which is primary in the deen. Whereas before I was spending late nights talking to brothers and not going home. Do you get what I mean? And that's why I feel like the MSA needs to have a certain growth. Like, have you experienced that?
I think it's a very good point. There's two things to be said here. First, on the specific issue of women, because that's a specific issue before I talk about the general issue. Look, at the end of the day, Islam has some parameters around what can and can't be done with women in terms of interaction. That's a given. And that's part of the tradition, and that cannot be denied, and it's there. Now, how that has been understood today and how it is applied in a society where we find ourselves so in the face of women all the time, that is a very good issue to explore, right? So my thoughts are that, look, sometimes and it happens in MSA. Sometimes they've gone way to the other extreme where it's like, just intermingling and talking, chit-chatting, like your friends and girl, you sort of boys and girls are friends. There's no limits at all. And that's wrong, okay?
Yeah.
But at the same time, this sort of, this culture of avoidance between sisters and brothers, almost to the point that any interaction between them is deemed as something to be looked down upon, which I know has developed in certain MSAs where there's been, let's say, perhaps a certain generation of very traditionally minded brothers or very conservative brothers or sisters for that matter. And I think that is unhealthy because it goes beyond what the fiqh requires you to do, right? The fiqh does not say avoid the other gender like the plague. That's not what Islam says, right? Islam says when you engage meaningfully. There must be a need. There must be some sort of purpose. And you must not be crafty in your mental gymnastics to create a purpose where it doesn't exist, because really what you want to do is seek the sister's hand in marriage, right? So it comes down to intentions. That's very, very important, that you don't create situations where you create interaction because you're interested in the other gender or whatever. But there's a very big space there between those two extremes where, sisters and brothers can and should genuinely engage in order to further the cause of Islam, in order to just sort of, do what needs to be done if you're in the same society, if you're in the same volunteer circle, and just behave appropriately and normally. Talk when you need to, talk normally when you need to. Of course, lower your gaze and all that sort of stuff. That's a given. That's a fard. That can't be sort of romantically gazing into someone's eyes and saying, "Oh, sister, great suggestion for the IAW." There's extremes here. There's things that we can't go beyond. But there's such a large ground where things are okay, right? Talking respectfully. Let's say a brother and sister are talking, and they're not in a private space, right? They're in a meeting room where there's other brothers and sisters, but they're engaged on a certain issue, or they're in a certain corner brainstorming certain things. People have broken out into little teams, whatever. There's room to have appropriate interactions in that sort of environment, right? Even out in the open, say you walk by a sister in the MSA, there's been certain culture in certain MSA saying, no, don't even acknowledge her existence, right? Just walk past as though she doesn't even exist. That's not what Islam says. Like to be able to say salam, for example, right? It's not going to open the doors to zina, right? Like really, you've got to have some serious hormonal issues for, one thing to lead to another from that sort of interaction. So I think, there has been a sort of a degree of, going beyond what is required at certain MSAs. And I think that's retarded the social development of certain brothers and sisters. And you can just tell, right? You can tell when you interact with them.
I can tell myself.
Like sort of twitching and sort of, it's like, that's not how we're meant to be. We can interact, we can say salam, we can even smile, for God's sake, and engage in a meaningful conversation with someone from the other gender within the bounds of what Islam allows, without it being the case that, our intentions have wavered from the purpose for which we came together, which is to serve the deen, is to learn, primarily when we're at university. But there we come across many Muslims and we interact with them and we work with them for a common purpose. And I don't think that's beyond the pale in any way. As for the more general issue, yes, look, definitely, again, you go through trends in MSAs, right? And so I think, reading between the lines, in the last sort of 5 years to a decade, as the community has matured and people have started pursuing Islamic knowledge a lot more, there have been some prominent students of knowledge at each campus who are really sort of pursuing knowledge and all that sort of stuff. I think there has been, in certain cases, cliques created of brothers and perhaps sisters as well, who approach Islam from a very academized pursuit of knowledge sort of perspective. Don't get me wrong, pursuit of knowledge is crucial, right? I remember back in the uni days being one of those guys in the sense of always doing classes and all that sort of stuff. But there has to be a marriage between that and the real world, right? Where you have to keep things in perspective. You can't let certain narrow-minded pursuits get the better of you to the exclusion of other Islamic obligations and priorities, right? So, debating the minutiae of a hadith and the classification of a certain type of hadith from the classical scholars and which book what thing was found in, like, there's more important things, unfortunately, for our society and for our community than that. Now, sure, there's a place for that, right? But if that overwhelms the needs of the community and the needs of the Muslim youth and the needs for what MSAs are created for in the first place, then there's a problem. And I think that probably has happened in some cases where, I guess brothers with very, very strong views have objected to certain types of events happening because, sisters get to sit, in the same room as brothers or something absurd like that. Like those sorts of things have happened. And I think that's an unfortunate, I wouldn't call it, I don't want to use the word extreme, has weird connotations, but that is like a a certain step too far, perhaps, for what's happened in certain cases.
I feel like at a certain level you become like the MSA can become like any other society where you just end up talking about your niche interests and you don't really further yourself or your community in any way. Like if I was doing the same thing with like the Marxist or socialist uni, that'd just be like, I don't know, just in their meetings talking about how capitalism and consumerism is so bad, but they're doing nothing much with their lives. You get what I mean?
100%. Yeah. And there is a big danger of that for young Muslims in the MSA scene, precisely because they have it so easy, relatively speaking, right? They're very privileged.
Definitely.
And they come from good families for the most part, good backgrounds, and there's a danger of really getting stuck in that little convenient and comfortable clique, and not remembering the purposes of MSAs in the first place. An MSA should really be a place where Muslims come together and they strive to do da'wah. They strive to take the message of Islam out, and they strive to serve other Muslims on campus, many of whom are not even practicing, right? And that's an audience that's almost entirely forgotten in all of this, right? Sort of practicing Muslims who are pursuing knowledge become like this cliquey little group that hang out with each other, discuss which books they're reading, which hadith is graded which way, which is fine. There's a place for that. But what about the hundreds of Muslims at a campus like ours, UNSW? There are probably hundreds of Muslims at this campus who do not pray.
Probably like 80%, I'd say. Yeah.
Perhaps, right? So where is the focus on them? And if we would have our priorities right, it's more important to pull someone who's in your sphere of influence, which being a campus means he's in your sphere of influence, to pull them from the potential danger of not praying than discussing some minute detail of Islamic law.
Definitely.
Right? And I think that's something that's been lost in all of this.
I think in regards to MSA boys, I feel that boys in general, they like to speak about, even amongst the, fiqh discussions, they'll talk about sport and cricket and stuff. So I think even brothers that interact with the MSA brothers, in the Musalla, for example, will easily slide into the crew because, they're talking about cricket. So I think from what I've experienced, it might be different for others, but the MSA boys are relatively, they bring in new people, where I've heard from the sisters' side, it becomes cliquey.
Interesting.
Well, I'm not going to make statements because I don't know. I'm not a sister and I'm not being in the sisters' prayer rooms or whatever.
Right.
Maybe I have, who knows. But so what I've heard, right, is that because I think MSA sisters, maybe the particular religious ones, they have a different focus, and then you have like Muslims who are just Muslim by culture. They tend to have different interests, so it just does not click. Like they cannot like get along, whereas boys, they tend to kind of get along over sports. They have that commonality focus.
Look, it's an interesting point. I'm not so sure, because I think sisters similarly have things that they can talk about, interact over. I think there's a lot that they can do, which we just don't know because we don't know, right? They don't know sports, many of them, in many cases, so they don't particularly, they may not think that brothers are, socializing over much, whereas sisters have other interests that they can come over, that they can sort of talk over. So I think it's the same on both sides, to be honest. Like this problem of developing cliques and not looking out to service the needs of other more vulnerable Muslims who need that help. I think that's a common problem across the MSA scene.
Definitely, like, becomes when with the practicing brothers hanging out together, it becomes very cliquey. And so people who aren't into the deen, they'll see them and they're like, I don't belong.
Yeah, 100%. And it's not a very welcoming space a lot of the time, unfortunately. There's very few brothers I've seen who have gone out of their way and been able to reach out to non-practicing brothers, be genuinely welcoming. I remember some interesting incidents back when I was at uni. Really the MSA brothers were seen in a certain light by the less practicing people. Yeah. Like they really, really were. There was like an aura around them, not a negative aura, right? In the sense of these guys all religious and unwelcoming, which is unfortunate, right? So really there needs to be a concerted effort for MSAs to be able to reach out to that sort of audience. Very, very important.
And I feel sometimes in that cliquey kind of practicing brothers, amongst that, they develop, I'm not going to, kind of stereotype everyone, but there becomes that idea of them judging other non-practicing Muslims. So they actually develop bad characteristics. And it's pretty bad because obviously it's not from the Sunnah or anything. And we should, even if you, like, you would know yourself and everyone else, like if you look through Rasulullah's life, he was always welcoming to all, obviously all types of, people of different levels of Iman. And
it's like in an effort to become Islamic, you become un-Islamic in your character.
Yeah, it's so weird how that works.
It's paradoxical in a way.
Yeah.
But for us, just to continue on from our discussion of the MSA, to move towards a general sort of idea of engagement as a community, because that's something you've always been doing in all the talks you've given around the Sydney campuses, is the idea of looking to a narrative bigger than yourself as a Muslim. So not only just caring about your family and your social gatherings and stuff, and looking towards like what the Muslim community is going through in a wider sense, and also what the Muslim world is going through in a political sense. I remember, like, I'll recount, this is just an anecdote of mine. I was in year 8, right? Or year 9.
Wow.
And just for the audience, me and Faraz went to the same school. So Faraz, he came back to school from university to give a Friday khutbah.
Okay. Wow.
So I was just a small kid sitting in the back row.
Wow.
And then the first thing you said on the khutbah in your Faraz tone was like, look, brothers, if you're looking to just get married, settle down, have a comfortable life, pray, no, this religion is not for you. Islam is not for you.
Wow.
Everyone just left. Everyone left.
You're right. That generally, I felt so bad because I was like, oh man, I just wanted to do what everyone else does and pray. Like, I want to have a girlfriend, I want to listen to music and just pray. And I thought that'd be good. But you're just like here changing my whole paradigm and worldview. Like, Islam requires further commitment. Like, you have to do more to be involved. But that was like my first sort of like, wow, okay, so this is bigger than just praying. Because you don't get a sense of that, like, in a lot of the environments we grew up in.
Alhamdulillah, Josh has started Boys in the Cave. Now he's here. You get all the hasanat after.
From that year 8, 13-year-old me. Yeah. But yeah, is that sort of, have you seen that as well in the Sydney community generally? Just like people becoming more aware of their, their obligations to the wider Muslim ummah?
Yeah, I think so. And alhamdulillah, I think it's going to only keep growing. I think it's a very good thing. It's a very important thing. Islam is a social religion. Right?
Exactly, yeah.
Islam, and I hate to use the word religion. We all know that something like system or nidam or something is far more appropriate in that sense, right? Islam is a social, communal way of life. It is definitely not about just one's individual relationship with Allah. That's not what it is.
Yeah.
True, every other relationship that one has to be geared towards their relationship with Allah, in the sense that they have to please Allah through each relationship and each interaction, how they behave, the dictates in each of the relationships, how I behave with you, is it appropriate? And that's, predicated on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said. So that much is a given, but it is a social religion, right? It is about mingling with other people. It is about changing other people for the better. It is about changing society for the better at the macro level, right? That's just undeniable. I mean, very intuitively, like when we listen to these stories of the prophets as kids, why was every single one of them struggling against his people? Why was every single one of them calling to something? Why was every single one of them, in the Qur'an, the stories that we hear, Yunus alayhi salam, Yusuf alayhi salam, Nuh alayhi salam, Lut alayhi salam, all of them, they're calling their people to something. Why are they calling? Right? What are they calling to? Even the thing after which your podcast is named, the story of the boys in the cave. Right, the boys who hid in the cave in the story of Surah Al-Kahf. Right, why did Allah deem them to be better than the rest of society? Like, all these things we think, right, the things that we've been taught since a young age, that they have a certain tenor to them, and the tenor is that Islam is something that you cannot just keep to yourself. It is not just about being comfortable and happy in your knowledge, in your private relationship with Allah. And if that's what we think Islam is, then we've misunderstood the religion. That's just a given. It is a social force that seeks to shape society in a certain way. That says certain things are good, that says certain things are bad, and it tries to shape society in that way. And so, if we want to emulate the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if we want to emulate the companions, if we want to emulate the scholars, if we want to emulate those who came before us and earned the rewards, and we want to strive towards Jannah, then it is a given that we must be part of that social movement for change, basically, at the most generic level, without sounding like I'm committed to any political school in the sense of the left wing or whatever. I'm not talking about social justice in that sense. I'm talking about the sense that Islam is a social, lived deen, and it's come as a force to shape people and their attitudes and their characteristics. And we must be a part of that. We must be part of changing that for the better.
I wanted to ask you, because you honed in on more social and society kind of elements of Islam. There's a lot of people, and I've encountered them as well, where Islam for them is all personal and spiritual, and you alluded to it in what you just said. And people were just like, it's the way I want to practice the religion. And for example, this is really bad. I feel like I'm hammering sisters. I first said that, all sisters, they don't get along with the non-practicing sisters. But for example, I don't know, I've just come across this, using sisters as an example, the way they want to wear the hijab, it's my expression, it's my Islam.
Right.
Or the way they want to style their outfits, it's my Islam, or how I want to kind of go about the religion. What would you say to those kind of people? It doesn't have to be just sisters, but even brothers. They want to practice Islam how they want to, and it's more internal, and they don't really, on the overall sense, don't really call people to Tawheed or Allah. You get me? So what would you...
I think for the sisters, like a different element is at play, which we can't comprehend.
Yeah, we can't.
We can't comprehend. So we can't quantify what the girls go through. Definitely.
I'm just speaking in generality, in the sense that there are the people like to internalize Islam and do acts of Islam that they want to.
Becomes more like a liberal thing, you're saying, as in like
you live it like traits. Yeah, there's traits of liberalism in it. But what would you say to that kind of situation?
So to look, it's an interesting. It's a very interesting discussion, potentially a contentious discussion, right? I feel, again, going back to our earlier discussion, that it's a lot more relevant in America. Maybe a little bit in Britain, not so much, but in America, in the American Muslim community. Over here, I really feel it's not that bad. We haven't seen this trend of, it's my Islam, it's my expression, it's my identity, I'll express it the way that I wish, right?
As in, I'm going to be Islamic in my own way.
That's right, I'm going to be Islamic in my own way. There's definitely elements of that, right? But look, it's not an easy thing to deal with, right? A lot of the time, people who are sort of living Islam this way, or who assert these sorts of things about Islam, you're seeing the outward manifestation of something that has gone wrong somewhere. Right? It may be that they never had access to Islamic knowledge. It may be that they grew up in a certain type of family that viewed Islam a certain way. It may be that they've had certain hardships in their life that have caused them to see Islam in that way. Right? Just examples like, for instance, certain brothers or sisters that I'm aware of that have taken this sort of vantage point, and then you end up sort of finding out one day that they were sexually abused as children, right? And that's shaped their view of what's important in Islam and what's not. Like, who are we to turn around and say to them, okay, actually, hang on, you're wrong on the fiqh there. There's a bit of empathy that needs to be had when entering these sorts of discussions. So that's the first thing I would say, that we need to recognize that every human has a lived reality that may be shaping their view, and we should try and understand that as a first port of call.
Just to add to that, before you go on, as I've gotten to sort of increase my friends groups over the past few years, like after the MSA, like you find out that a lot of the reason why people aren't practicing is exactly because of that, of very specific and extreme, like family circumstances. Like it's crazy stuff. Like you wouldn't even believe the things people go through. So we can't ever talk for someone and be like, why are they doing Islam like that? They probably had no better.
That's right. Yeah.
Ideal.
Yeah. But that said, obviously this is now the second part of it, which is that, whatever could have happened has happened. Nonetheless, Allah tells us certain things, Rasulullah told us certain things, and we have to do the best that we can to adhere to those, come what may, of whatever's happened in our life. And I think that now this is a place where there's deftness required, there's compassion required, there's da'wah required for sure, and there's hisbah, enjoining the good, forbidding the evil required, right? But it's the combination of all of these things that I think is the only way that you can start addressing such individuals, right? And so obviously, we all know of some very bad da'wah that's been done to such people, which only turns them further away from the deen, right? Don't like to use the phrase, but let's say certain self-righteous attitudes, right? In the way such people are approached. So instead of, as I mentioned earlier, a degree of empathy or compassion being the platform through which they're engaged on, rather it becomes a sort of judgmental, brother, sister, this is wrong, you're wrong, it's haram, stop doing it this way, it's sinful, and so forth. And so there needs to be care taken in that, right? Definitely the absolutes and the parameters of Islam remain. They don't change with people's personal circumstances, right? And we're not talking the extremes of if one finds themselves in a desert, like obviously that's a given, right? That sort of stuff, the exceptions to the fiqh rules. But by and large, the parameters are the same for all of us, right? But when we give advice to people to help them come back onto that straight and narrow, we need to keep in mind what they've been through, what could be affecting them. And I think in that regard, once that is said and done, then yes, there's a place for saying, look, bro, sis, I think I'd like to give you some advice. Would you be willing to consider what I have to say? Now, just those words, how many people are capable of saying them? How many people say them as the starting point to a discussion, even though it seems like such an obvious way to soften someone up, open a conversation. But in the moment of the heated WhatsApp conversation or the heated discussion at the dawah stall or after a khutbah or something like that, or even between friends, you rarely see that as the way that discussions are started. Yet this is what Islam tells us, right? That the methodology of the Prophet, the way of giving nasiha, what the scholars have said of the softness with which advice needs to be given. If that is followed, then to be honest, which person will sit across the room from someone adopting that sort of tone and not want to listen to what they have to say? And it's just that we forget that. Like our conversations become so snappy, so adversarial, so, just a matter of correcting people rather than wanting the best for them. And I think that really is what it's about. If you think from the perspective of, I want what is the best for this person, you will do everything to adopt the right strategy, to soften them up, to open them up, and help them be open-minded. In that sense, approaching people with compassion, while still very much being firm on the straight and narrow, helps. And you need to combine the two when you give advice and help people realize that, to be honest, Sister Tanzim, sorry.
You just switched up
the way that you're doing your hijab, okay, I wouldn't even start with that. I'd say, sister, I'd love to have a chat with you sometime if you've got some free time. Let's have a coffee, right?
I reckon as a guy, you shouldn't be doing that anyway.
Well, no, definitely not.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Why are you remixing here, Faraz?
I'm pretending I'm a sister. I'm pretending you're a sister,
Okay.
right? Or, Brother Josh.
Just as giving advice as a guy anyway. You should get your...
100%. No. Thanks for that clarification. But, Josh, you're a brother. I'm a brother. Bro, just wanted to see, how you were doing. Let's have some lunch next week sometime and let's have a chat. Just want to have a chat. You may ask or you may not ask, what is it about? Yeah. But let that come out naturally in a brotherly way in a discussion. And you'll turn people's lives around like that. To be honest, I've had people have these conversations with me. Yeah. And I know the good conversations from the bad. I've had people have both good and bad conversations of this nature, right? Because let's face it, we all make mistakes. We all do the wrong thing. I can remember clearly good conversations. I can remember clearly bad conversations. Bad conversations that turned me against people and which organization they're with or the mentality that they adopt for the rest of my life as a result of how it was that
one conversation,
one conversation, and it's so hard to turn that around. It's so I'm telling you from my own honest experience.
It's like you have to be Islamic, but you still have to be a human being, like in how you deal with 100%.
People. It's a very fine line, and you can irreparably damage not just your own relationship with people, but their view of normative quote unquote Islam, and conservative and traditional Islam. And
so I was going to ask that question, you'll take into consideration the emotions and stuff earlier with your point one, and I was going to ask being more pragmatic, because some people use their past experience as a fallback option of why they don't have to be Islamic, if that makes sense. So I've been through all this stuff, that's why I'm not practicing, but it's like a fallback option it's like a excuse essentially. Get what I mean? So I feel that sometimes happens, even though I understand that people go through certain traumatic experiences and this and that, but then it becomes an excuse not to pray.
Look,
you get me? So
there's a limit to everything, right? There's a limit to every excuse. There's a limit to what people ultimately need to think of is, could you stand in front of Allah on the Day of Judgment and make this excuse? That's it, right? And every individual has to be honest with themselves, right? And if you couldn't, and most people will know deep down if they can't. They've really forget the social performance and putting justifications up for others. A person will know deep down if they could stand honestly in front of their Lord and make that excuse. And if their deep down answer to that is no, they couldn't, then really they shouldn't be making it to people in this life. And I think that's the ultimate barometer for this sort of stuff.
So, Faraz, you were saying, just to touch back on the first point you made about how Islam is a social force, you were saying. And I always get the sense that to be fully Muslim, you always have to have this certain strife with society. You can never sort of just go along with the flow and do what everyone else is doing. And I think obviously you're going to find that, I think most strongly in Western societies where we live, where it's so easy to go and do what everyone else is doing. But even in Islamic countries now, as in because the governments are usually pretty corrupt and bad, as in there's a certain sense of holding your own. It's like our theme of The Boys in the Cave, which is pretty much why we chose it, that you always have to have a certain way of coming back to what was original. But to shift now onto sort of how that ties in with politics in Islam on a general, more ideological level, and the sentiments of how the community and how things have changed, because I think you've overlooked and overseen a lot of that change in the community. Because from yourself, you come from a very politically conscious angle. And I think you've always been committed through social media and your events and talks about making these things happen where the community is not so moderate, quote unquote, so to speak, and we're more contesting narratives, contesting how the debate should be framed and how the media represents us. And on that topic as well, then where would you think the community's at right now? As in, is there still a lot more work to be done? Or have we reached a stage where things are much better now?
Look, things are definitely better than what they were 15 years ago. 10 years ago? 10 years ago? Things were really bad. Like, I can tell you guys, and I was very young back then. Let's be honest. I wasn't like some campaigner or experienced sort of stalwart of the community. I was young. I was very young. At the time of September 11, at the time, when I was finishing high school, sort of 2006, things were pretty bad, right? And credit has to be given to those voices in the Muslim community who have championed the resistance narratives, right? And there's clear, there's clear personalities, there's clear groups who have done a lot to basically, move the needle, so to speak, in the direction of a much more resistance-based politics that seeks to, resist the narratives that exist. So, whether it's the likes of Hizb ut-Tahrir or some of the sort of the Salafi elements of the community, and then later on, some of our activist brothers and sisters from a more academic background, like Brother Yasser and so forth. There have been several voices that have existed that have helped shift the narrative to a more resistance-based one. Plus, I think there's also been just some natural evolution of communal politics as a result of finding ourselves in certain contexts. You can only be beaten and battered for so long before you start realizing, hang on a minute, right? Being a suck up or sort of just kowtowing to what's going on is really not going to get me anywhere, right? And so, alhamdulillah, I do think that the bad old days of so-called quote unquote moderate Muslim type politics are over. I really feel that with the exception of a few very isolated voices in our community, that sort of bending backwards to appease the powers that be is a thing of the past. And I think there's a lot of upward pressure from the on-the-ground elements of the community against that, right? On Muslim organizations, on speakers, to the point that you now have organizations that once upon a time were these ones that were doing CVE and lining up to take government money are now among the ones criticizing government policy, right? And who would have thought that? And so, back in the day when the likes of HT, were early on sort of championing some of these resistance
criticizing
the government, they used to be, very, very badly treated by some other elements of the community. And it's a credit to them for how they held their voice, how they helped steer the community in a certain direction. And of course, there's other independent voices that I mentioned as well, who really showed the importance of resisting and the necessity of doing so. And I think we have all been all the better for it. So, credit must be given to those forces and those personalities. And I think we are in a much better position now. But still, there's work to be done. Because people waver. Sometimes, some people are very opportunistic. They'll be sort of like, Edward Said's and Malcolm X's one day, and the next day they're like sitting at, government iftars and stuff like that. So there's a lot of people who haven't figured out where they are, and they just need to keep interrogating their own politics until, like we all do, to be honest. It's a lifelong exercise until we've figured out, where we should be and how our positionality should be.
Just to take all that into account now of this political coming of age, I guess, where would you think the Muslim community would need to focus now? Because I feel like there's been for myself, this focus on politics and just a very, international relations based, I guess, understanding of how our resistance to the West should be, or always the West, they're hypocritical, or they intervene in Muslim countries, that sort of thing. And I feel like an alternative, which is really big in America in a certain way, is this return to traditionalism. Do you get what I mean? I guess in California, the West Coast of America, it's this return to the grassroots of Islam, change your personal habits, change the way you eat, change the way you consume generally and live your life. And that's how, as a Muslim, you should be now. Do you get what I mean? And that's all you need to combat the West. And you don't need to worry yourself about the larger issues because it's not within your personal ambit. Do you get what I mean? But I feel like that goes to another extreme in a certain sense. As in, it's really hard. as a Western Muslim to strike that balance? Because obviously we don't live in an Islamic society where we can change the society. We have to change ourselves in a certain way. But how do you do that? Do you get what I mean?
It's the $1 million question, isn't it? So, look, I would say this, that the importance of having your personal habits, your personal characteristics shaped by Islamic ethics and our tradition, keeping in mind, is very important, right? Bringing into that understanding a sophisticated reading of the world, which helps understand where we are and how we contribute to the situation that exists, inadvertently, obviously, because none of us wants the situation to be this way, is also important, right? So it's about recognizing that ultimately you're part of this massive, massive web called global modern capitalism, which by virtue of your very consumption, you are contributing to. By virtue of breathing, you're contributing to.
By living in the West.
By living in the West.
Automatically.
That's right, in some way, shape or form.
Benefiting from,
Correct. So then it becomes a question of agency, right? Is that the fact that that happens, does that mean I'm like powerless? Look, and this is where Islamic law kicks in. There needs to be this part of the discussion, that what does Islamic law or usul al-fiqh have to say about these issues, right? Will you be judged by Allah on that basis? And the answer to that is probably no, Allahu alam, of course. But if it is beyond your power to do something, you will not be judged for that. So the individual Josh or Tanzim is not going to be held accountable for the ills of capitalism because he wears a shirt that was manufactured in China.
That's what I was going to say, right? As in the minutiae of me wearing a shirt that was made by labor, which is obviously all clothes, pretty much 99% of clothes in the world is made by conditions that the workers work in, which is horrid. So
absolutely.
Do you get what I mean? Like, how can you contest that?
So
do we have to wear $200 shirts?
Yeah. So this is the thing, right? So it's like whether you buy a $5 shirt or a $200 one, probably it's coming from there, right? Now, short of setting up your own micro community where you farm, harvest, create clothes, food, and shelter, all for yourself, you're not going to be able to get out of that, right? And to be honest, we all know that that's impractical. Right? It's not going to happen. So the question of taklif, the question of legal responsibility on the mukallaf, on the layperson, that's where this discussion lies. Right? And there's no way, absolutely no way, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will burden you with individual responsibility for the situation in which we find ourselves as a result of 400 years of history and political evolution. That's where we are. But what's important is being conscious of that. I think that's what our deen requires of us, that we are conscious of how it is that we got there and how do we find ourselves in this web, right? Now, what do we do from that? Look, at an individual personal level, the best we can do is what you said before, Josh, right? Which is be conscious of it, do the best that you can to eat ethically, consume ethically, wear ethically, talk ethically, and so on and so forth, right? Be cognizant of these oppressions. But there can be no escaping that the real change to all of this does not lie with individual activism. It does not lie with individual resistance by way of better consumption habits. It lies at a macro level change, which, to be honest, is, it can only be a radical change, right? And it's not going to happen here. It's not going to happen in these countries. We're talking about a reshaping of the very world order in which we live. And that's something that it's way bigger than us, right? We know that. What that requires of us, at the very least, it requires awareness. It requires awareness that there is a great obligation upon the Muslim Ummah to resume, really an Islamic way of living, which is more than just consumption of grass-fed chicken, right? Grass-fed, non-hormone, non-GMO chicken. It is about living by the deen of Allah, right? Now, that's a huge, huge, huge problem, which is probably beyond people like us to be able to figure out what to do with. But at the very least, we need to know that. We need to be open about that. We need to be conscious of that. And we need to recognize that fact. And that is as in line with our tradition as is the importance of not eating a genetically modified chicken, right? And I'm trivializing this for that reason, is that this is so many of the problems go back to the way that this world order is shaped. And we cannot escape the fact that Islam has a lot to say about the way that this world order is shaped, and it will shape the world very, very differently. So how can we be forgetting about that and be worrying about, not that I'm saying you're doing this, but be obsessed with the micro level transgressions that result from capitalism when the problem is at the macro level. It's its very existence, right?
So just to clarify for us, are you saying on air That we need a revolution.
Look, revolution sounds like a very...
I know, it's a different discourse. It's not
it's a
how we
different
talk about
discourse.
it.
It's not how we talk. It's revolution sounds like the socialist type thing. Bro, it's even beyond a revolution. Like, it's so seismic, the change that we're talking about, right? That it's difficult to put into words.
Yeah.
It's a different world that we're talking about, right? And this requires for a lot of things to align. It requires for a lot of things to happen. It's a long game. And really, it requires the will of Allah to be on the side of the Muslim Ummah and to click into gear the change that we all know one day will happen because it's prophesized. But how it will happen, we don't know. How it will happen, where it will happen. The very least we can do is to be conscious that it's necessary, that it's an obligation on the Ummah as a whole, and to be very open about that, about the necessity of that. At the very least, as everyday Muslims, we have to acknowledge that much.
So, like from all this, like, we have to come to first an understanding of the world. And I think what you're calling for is what other, I guess, learned people also call for, as in people who've studied how the world works and sort of the webs of oppression that sort of benefits us, the West, whereas 80% of the world is in absolute poverty, under $10 a day.
Absolutely.
As in, as a Muslim, you should be aware of these things before conducting your life and how you live. So that's why I see the perspective that people who want to eat organic food comes from. Like, they want things which don't have a line of oppression.
Yes.
As in, they want to
Very understandable.
have that clean conscience. Do you get what I mean? Because the whole world doesn't have that.
Yeah. But there's another thing to be said about that, right? Is that a lot of the times people are just seeking an exit from the feeling of guilt and the feeling of powerlessness that pervades us, right? But the reality is, and you have to hate to break it to these people, is that you may be eating really good chicken, right? But there's some people that can't afford to eat that chicken. Yeah. What then? Right? And that, funnily enough, ironically, is just reinforcing the very point that I'm making. The fact that some people can make those sorts of ethical choices and some people, for financial reasons, cannot. Yeah. They cannot afford but to eat rubbish, which is produced in a rubbish way, but that's the only thing that their money will buy.
Yeah, ironically, like, I think the people who are at the receiving end of all this sort of oppression, say the black community in America, as in, because of their state and their poverty, they're sort of the most likely to get obese because they eat McDonald's, because that's all that's available to them. And they won't ever get to that level where they're working a job where the whole community can eat organic. Right. Do you get what I mean? Exactly. It's like, if the people on the receiving that you're benefiting from can't even aspire to the ideal that you're preaching, then, like, it's not consistent anyway. Do you get what I mean?
100%. So
like in Bangladesh, like, they have the worst plastic pollution and the food they eat, like, has been processed as well. What are they going to do? They have no way of getting
getting outside this web. So, that's the unfortunate reality of the situation. And that's why, I don't have the answers, far from. I think anyone who pretends they have the answers is kidding themselves of what exactly is going to happen, how it's going to happen. But the only thing that we know is that Allah has promised it, and we should constantly affirm the importance of that. And really, to be honest, it's the only way out. It's you're not going to ethically eat your way out of this situation, or dress your way out of this situation. This really needs seismic change, and we're talking, sort of change on the level of world politics. Like, that's the only way to put it.
And to backtrack to what you were saying earlier about what the MSA has been focusing on now, and what the community should focus on. Say, you're talking about our more local issues, that we shouldn't always think about these, I don't know, like ideas that permeate us, or like the world is in such a bad condition. What about, like, the real issues we're facing here? Like, a lot of people have turned towards highlighting those, like domestic abuse within the Muslim community. Things like addiction and things of that nature. Do you get what I mean?
Absolutely.
As in, things that are very real to us, very close, but we haven't addressed. Would you say that's the direction forward in terms of how, I guess, young Muslims like ourselves in the MSA should focus their efforts? Like, what is the way forward?
Interesting.
From, like, as a survey of what the knowledge you've gained being through the MSA and working now, what would you say is the way forward?
Look, the importance of that cannot possibly be understated, right? The importance of doing that local community work to help those in need, to help those suffering, because there's a lot of people suffering. There's a lot of people suffering, whether it's, things like domestic violence abuse or drug addictions or, whatever, pornography. There's been some good work done around youth and pornography in the last little while, which I think is very, very needed, because the problem is absolutely massive. Like, there's no other way to put it. It's huge, right? So this sort of stuff is crucial, right? This sort of stuff is absolutely crucial. I guess, and it's important local work that can help change people's material conditions. And that's crucial, right? But at the same time, we cannot forget that macro level picture. We cannot ever stop discussing it. We cannot ever stop having it at the forefront of our mind. I guess what is important is that we don't discuss it so much that it paralyzes us from the work that can be done to seek to improve people's lives at a local level. So I think it's like, you keep the ideal in mind, but you get realistic about what you can do, and you keep working keep working in the meantime on what you can influence. 100%. Yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of... I want to kind of hone in on the idea, like you want to see changes on like the grand scale. From my kind of how I go about, I guess society and the Muslim community, I'll say blatantly, it sounds like the Sufis will be more so, let's get all the organic, food and this and that and live like the Amish kind of lifestyle, right? And then you have the more, I don't know, I'd say people in the middle level, like the normal Muslims, not normal Muslims, but just everyday Muslims would be better. Just engage with the system and try to limit ourselves from, the negative stuff, and not try to engage too much with the capitalism, but do it to the best of our abilities. But there is the other not extreme, but another spectrum where, we have to do the work on the grand scale and, see the problem lies with capitalism and make changes on that kind of grand scale. I feel like everyone's doing their kind of role. So I guess the Sufis are more... I feel like because, for example, let's talk about halal eating. Because of the meat, they know a lot of barakah from actually, doing it that proper halal way. It's immense. So they try to concentrate on that. So it has kind of effects on the spiritual level for some people. Whereas I feel like some people more politically aligned, they may also see those benefits, but they want to exert their efforts in a different way. So I feel like everyone in the community is playing a role in one way, shape or another. But as you mentioned, like me personally, you don't know what is the answer to it all.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
exactly. I don't know which path to go down, because I'm just like, so which one is like...
One's the haq. No, but I've kind of taken it as everyone's doing their kind of role, because I don't feel everyone can be, spiritually inclined. Like, I think it was, someone mentioned, like, even Salafism may seem like out there to some people, but there's a wisdom for why Salafism exists, because you'll notice some brothers, they just love the hard talks by, Salafi preachers, and it inclines to them, rather than compared to someone like Hamza Yusuf who's more spiritually inclined. So, have you tried to view it in that lens where everyone's kind of playing their role, are you saying that your way of seeing it is the haq?
No.
Would you say it's a psychological profile thing? As in, whatever floats your boat. If you're into more like hands-on, like changing your physical environment, or more about the theory and changing the world.
Interesting.
I'm pretty sure it has something to do with your own appeal and like what part of the deen appeals to you. 100%, yeah.
So look, it's definitely got an element of psychology. There's no denying it, right? Everyone's outlook is shaped by their personal experience, who they are as a person, what's happened in their life, all that sort of stuff, right? That's a given, right? Now, look, you will never be able to change the fact that there will be this spectrum of people who are concentrating on different things. Someone's doing his food, someone's doing his politics and more overt sort of activism type stuff. Someone's doing his Qur'an and Sunnah, no bid'ah, that sort of stuff, right? That's a given, right? But I do think that there are certain imperatives that exist that every Muslim needs to worry about, irrespective of which group they belong to, which manhaj they belong to, or whatever. And these imperatives are that you have to abide by Islam in your personal life, right? You have to strive to be a good Muslim. You have to strive to gain knowledge. That's a given. It's a lifelong exercise, right? And then that you have to have concern for the ummah. You have to have concern for her condition, locally and globally, right? There's no excuse. You can't just be like, I'm just going to worry about the local stuff. No, you have to worry about what's happening globally. You have to. That is part of being a Muslim. It's part of your aqidah that you have to worry about what is happening to your brothers and sisters. What you do about it is a separate question, right? But this is what I mean by certain imperatives. To be concerned, to have that concern. And then yes, ideally, that you do something, that everyone does something with that in mind. Now, if that leads them to a certain answer, if they end up joining the Tableeghi, because they feel that the macro level issue is only answered by Muslims becoming better personally and being in the mosques and stuff, then good luck to you, right? Really. Absolutely. If that's what you sincerely end up believing, give it your heart and soul. Give it your heart. Join your hands with someone. Do something. Right? Give it your heart and soul. So it comes down to, being sincere to the inquiry that you've had, and then, letting that flow through to some sort of action. So in that sense, I believe, yes, everyone's got their role to play, and nothing I say or do will change that. People of all stripes will always exist, but the imperatives, I believe, are that people need to worry about the local and global condition of the ummah, of their families, of their individuals, and work to understand their obligations in that sense and do something about them. It's not sufficient to just go with the flow. It's not sufficient to just be as you are and be unconcerned and not worry about activism and not worry about doing something. That, I think, is unacceptable. So in that sense, if a person is just happy eating organic chicken, then yeah, there's a problem. That, I think, is not acceptable. To be just worried about one's personal hal, a condition, to the exclusion of what's happening to their brothers and sisters locally and globally. I think that, I don't care what group you are, I don't care what your label is, that's wrong. That's not sufficient.
So there has to be that shared foundation of
it has to, absolutely,
concern.
It's because you brought the argument. Obviously, capitalism exists, and we need to do it from the top down kind of way. And then there'll be like a Tableeghi or more of a Sufi inclined person. They'll come up to you and be like, "Look, because the ummah probably 10% only pray, we need to go from bottom up because it's obviously Allah." It's like they give the example of Musa alayhi salam and Bani Israel, that one person who sinned and it fell upon the whole ummah. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like every group has legit.
And if that's the case, good, fine.
Yeah. Go
out there and help make people better Muslims. That would be my answer. Go out there, get out of your house, right?
Yep.
Go knock doors. Go to mosques. Go to MSAs, do whatever you need, but put in effort towards what you believe will sincerely change the ummah's condition. Do it. And don't just spend time at home. Don't just be worried about yourself and your family. Go out there. Be external. Take your vision and do that. That's what I would say.
I think that's a good way to kind of wrap up this phrase.
Just as a final point to get whatever we can from Faraz while he's here. What would you, at this stage of your understanding on what you've come to see of sort of the MSA scene, young Muslims, what would be your takeaway point of advice for sort of young Muslims such as ourselves?
The world is bigger than you, much bigger than you. There are big problems in the world. Understand that you have it very, very easy. Study, look at the world beyond you, try and understand the problems and struggles that people have, learn some empathy, engage with the real world, don't be overly idealistic, and get your hands dirty. Get involved. Do things. Definitely keep trying to seek knowledge and make yourself better as a Muslim. Learn something every day. Make every day an effort at gaining more and more knowledge and being a better Muslim in that sense. But don't forget that there is a world beyond you that Allah has obliged you to try and affect, and that you will be asked on the Day of Judgment what you have done about that. So your deen, this ni'mah that you've been given, this blessing that you've been given, of all of its ethics, morals, practices, from micro to macro, that is a blessing. And you'll be asked what you did to share that with others, whether they're Muslim and not practicing or non-Muslim. So learn about that, understand that, and see what you can do to change things for the better. Don't ever be content with the status quo and being as you are, as you found and inherited, through your family. Make explicit effort. That is very, very important. And always appreciate someone doing something for the sake of Allah, even if you defer with them an approach, right? So you may be let's use the terms that you use, Tanzim. You may be a Sufi, right? You may not like Salafis much, but try and look at the fact that of the possibility that in this day and age, that person could have been nightclubbing and doing drugs and hanging out with prostitutes, right? They've chosen to embody an Islamic ideal, and they've chosen to try and live their life according to that ideal. That is a noble thing, right? Always compare Muslims you have a problem with to the wider society, and things will seem a lot better.
Did you say whiter or wider?
Wider.
Okay,
wider.
Just clarifying.
Could have said whiter. And I think that will always help us temper the disagreements and differences we have within ourselves as a community, so that we can unite on what we can get together and aim for of communal objectives.
Sorry for us. Just as a final point.
Final. Okay.
We're trying to make a practice of asking every guest this: if you were to sit in a cave,
speak one.
For,
one person.
One person?
Yeah, just one person.
Okay, just one person who you've. It doesn't necessarily have to be a scholar, and no Sahabi or Prophet allowed. Yeah. That has helped you in your understanding of the Deen or in your life generally that you look up to, that you would like to have an extended conversation with.
Wow, that is an incredible.
Yeah, we do a habit now.
Yeah, we're trying to do it for all our guests.
So who would I have in the cave? My goodness.
You have Rasul already there. Chilling with
no
the
scholars
Sahaba.
allowed.
No,
Yeah.
But they're all there.
They're all
but
there.
you've got one.
Has it got to be someone you've met already and you never
Well,
got
a historical
anyone in
figure,
history.
someone you've read, or maybe
It could
if
be
it's someone
you've met.
in your life, not everyone might.
But
be
you
able
have
to
the
look at
option
that.
to pick anyone else in history.
There's a couple of people who I'd rather not say because it's a private thing, right? But they've
Just as a public thing.
Okay.
A public,
Which one
so public figure. you
Yeah.
mean.
Which one you're cool to say publicly? Which one?
Right. Oh,
Like Malcolm X or something. Doesn't have to be
Right.
Malcolm X.
Yeah.
but
No, okay. Well, let me think. Let me think. At this point, you can pause, obviously.
Yeah.
So let me just think.
Oh man.
No, there's too much scope. You gotta limit it down.
No,
He wants his opinion. Like that's a
No, that's fine. I
because
appreciate
Faraz
that.
said Fanon, and I don't know.
Who?
Like,
Yasser.
Yasser said Fanon,
Yeah.
Edward Said, and another Bell Hooks, another
Right.
feminist.
And what did Uthman say?
We didn't ask him yet. We hadn't developed the question.
Ah.
yet. So it was like for Faraz's field, that's what
Right.
inspired him. We was
Okay.
like, who in your field inspired you?
Right.
For yourself, I'm not too sure like what
Yeah.
your field is. It's more like
Yeah. No, hang on. Let me just think, bro. Let me just think. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think the figure that, funnily enough, a namesake, but not for that reason. So there was an Indian scholar by the name of Maulana Shibli Nomani, right? He lived in the 1900s, early 1900s. He was a scholar of Hanafi fiqh, and he wrote a famous book on the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a seerah of Umar radiallahu anh, and many other books. He was a scholar of the Indian subcontinent. And the reason I say him is he lived at an interesting time where India was being, the Muslims of India were in a very difficult position. And I'm from India, obviously, so that's close to my heart. There was obviously that late colonialism sort of period. And there was also a period where the Ottoman Caliphate was in its death throes, as it were, right? So a person of knowledge, you're living in this chaos, right? How do you navigate all this? What do you think through? How do you think through all of this, right?
Yeah.
How do you bring your knowledge with which you've had so much time to learn over so many years, and yet you see this world that is in absolute chaos? How do you reconcile the two? What's going through your head? And I would be fascinated to have that conversation with him and see what he would have made of it at his time. There's other figures that come to mind as well. Another sort of, that's my figure, I suppose. But
go for it.
like another scholar of the subcontinent. Again, I'm from there, and I think the subcontinent is a neglected part of our Islamic
Definitely,
heritage. It's a very rich part of it.
Yeah.
So Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, very, very famous scholar from Delhi, modern day Delhi, lived about 300 years ago, 400 years ago, seen by some as like really the mujaddid of his century, even, right? The reviver of Islam. Or Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi as well, very famous, especially in sort of Sufi circles, who probably came about 500 years ago. But these were some eminent figures who were very social in their outlook. They were not just scholars of letter, they were activists, right? They helped, they challenged rulers, the Mughal sultans in some cases, they agitated, they advocated, they did activism on the ground to help move society in a certain way. It'd be fascinating to talk to them and see why they did that, how they did that, and what they saw for the future, and what an ideal lived Islam looks like for them.
As you said, like Indian Muslim scholars are quite disregarded, and I think also because they lived in a society which was not hospitable, like the West we live in now. Because 80%, well, not 80, you would say 80%. It was Hindu, the society they lived in. So they had to live in a foreign society.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, when Muslims had power in India, it was a different situation.
True, it was a different situation.
In that time.
But it's more like they knew how to navigate diversity.
Yes,
know what I mean?
100%,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, the Mughal court is, famous for having all sorts of people around it all the time.
One of the most diverse.
I think the history of Muslim India is a fascinating history which needs to be told more of. We know a lot more about the Ottomans now.
Yeah.
It's a very famous, because of all the TV shows and all that sort of stuff, and the Khilafah Rashida and all that sort of stuff. But I think this is an interesting part of our history that is a little bit neglected in our sort of more Arab-centric Muslim Australian community.
Definitely.
But it would be fascinating
They
to
should
talk to some of
do
those people.
like a Bollywood movie on Muslim history. Like Shah Rukh Khan, Amir Khan.
That's
But,
the last thing
that would be interesting.
Yeah.
But Shah Waliullah, I think he even did like of his time refutations against like atheism and
That's
God's
right.
proof.
Exactly.
It's pretty like
Absolutely.
smart. It's amazing.
Yeah. He was an amazing figure. Yeah.
But just wrap it up there. But Jazakallah khair, Faraz, for coming on Boys in the Cave. It's been long kind of overdue, as I mentioned earlier, and you've been a figure in the community as well. So I'm hoping, inshallah, we'll do a few more episodes as well in the future.
Inshallah, it's been an absolute pleasure and an honor. Trust me, I say that very honestly, and I commend you, brothers, for the work you're doing to elevate the level of discourse and conversation. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help you in that.
Ameen. So for all our listeners, thank you for giving us your attention. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us at info@boysinthecave.com. We've changed it up from our previous email. Yeah, we're going up, alhamdulillah. We're rising up the ranks. And find us on Facebook as well. And you can follow our journey on Instagram. Please leave a 5-star rating on iTunes, as that greatly helps us. And, support us through Patreon as well. We've got many ties. You can donate $1 a month or $5 a month, and you get other little, small benefits from that. So inshallah, check patreon.com/boysinthecave. So from our special guests, Faraz, Josh, and myself, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing you off. Assalamu alaikum.